Okay. Good morning, church. Yes, I just want to thank everyone who came to watch me preach. I really appreciate it. It's good to know that I have people who are here to support me. My preach. So, to start off, I'm sure most people saw the name of the preach. It is relying on God versus relying on ourselves. So, to start off, I just want to say if we look at the word, right? If we actually look at how people were made or the nature of flesh, we were made to rely on God. We can look at Adam in the garden. He would always stay accountable to God and he would always rely on God. But then there was a moment where that changed. That was the fall of man when they decided to eat off the fruit. So with that, there was a separation between man and God. And the more I looked into it, I saw that with that separation, we started to rely on ourselves. With everything that we do, with whatever we want to put our hearts into, we relied on ourselves. And with the things which God gave Adam to do, he would tell him that, oh, you need to, work to get food. These are tasks you do by yourself, but then you rely on God to accomplish those things because we realize that flesh gets tired. We all get tired. And I just want to use an example which Uncle Tulani gave us at Alpha, where he was talking about the nature which Adam had in the garden, how he looked at Eve. It was pretty funny because he was saying that, oh no, he admired Eve, it's like the flesh of my flesh, he was saying that she was beautiful, right? But then if you see the way things are now and the way he did things then, it changed. The nature of flesh changed. Instead of him actually looking at his wife in such a way where he's admiring her, it became lust. So that was just another thing, seeing how much things change from the way it was intended to the way it is now. So the influence of the world has caused us to rely on ourselves. There's multiple things in media. You see how people say women are strong, independence is strength. So they're teaching us to rely on ourselves. Yeah, so hopefully I didn't offend any feminists out there. Sorry. Yeah, it's just an example, guys. You know, but then yeah, so with that, there's results to everything we do. you know and I don't really want to focus on the ourselves part. I want to really dig deep into how we have to rely on God and how different it is from relying on ourselves. But then I just want to highlight what happens when we rely on ourselves, right? For example, you struggling with a constant sin, you continue on sinning so much, right? Instead of relying on God to help you, because there's multiple sins out there, like addictions, right? You get hooked on something. Instead of going to God and actually trying to let God change you, we rely on ourselves. We put the weight on ourselves, and that causes separation even more, where we shy away from God. And that's something which the devil wants. He doesn't want us to have a relationship with God. And when we struggle with that sin, we put that weight on ourselves and we're like, no, I'm the one who's doing all the wrong things. I'm the one who's sinning. Instead of actually saying, God, I'm relying on you because He is our Father. Some things we can't just put on ourselves. There's many things which happen in the world which causes us to sin. I'm not saying that you're not responsible for your sin, but then you put the weight on ourselves. We put the weight on ourselves, and that just causes us to continue on separating from God, right? So that just wraps up ourselves part, going on relying on God. Okay, I want to use examples which were given to us by the Bible. the Bible gives us many people, many stories which we can use to see how people relied on God. So the first one I want to look at is Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 9 to 10. For I am the least of the apostles, and do not even deserve to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am. And his grace to me was not without effect. No, I worked harder than all of them. Yet not I, but the grace of God that was with me. So right there, I was reading this verse with a friend of mine, and as I was reading it, it was the time when I was preparing for this preach, I was seeing that Paul didn't rely on his own works. Yes, he acknowledged the fact that he did work, but then he's acknowledging the fact that it was through God's grace. And already through that, you can see that he was relying on God. He was not looking at what he was doing. He was looking at what God was doing through him. So that was just one person which I wanted to actually point out. And there's multiple people. For example, Moses. We all know the story of Moses. He was chosen by God, but then he had a speech impediment, and then he tried to shy away from God. But then when he relied on God, God used him to help his chosen people. They were taken out of Egypt, and multiple things were done. Noah, he built the ark, right? He was a very good example of people working. He worked for so long building something which was supposed to sustain animals, sustain his family for such a long period of time. But then if you look at it, he relied on God. If we were to put the weight of creating an ark on ourselves, I'm sure it would have failed. But then it was through relying on God, he was able to build it, right? So, yes, there's relying on God, but then there's so many contributing factors to what really helps us rely on God, and the vocal part or the main part of this preach is the role of family, friends, and the church, right? So the point which I want to point out with the story is our reliance on God is influential, right? A bit of story time. I was at school, since I'm still a student, but then, I was at school, it was, 1, 2, 1, okay, So I was at school, right, and I was sitting, waiting with my friends, because I normally decide to wait with them after school because that's how I am, But then while I was waiting with them, I have a friend of mine, he is atheist, and he decided to bring up a conversation of religion where he was like, the normal atheist questions, I'm not going to bring them up here because it's just a headache, but then he started talking about these things. And at first, I didn't want to argue with him. I didn't want to have a conversation with him because I'm like, I know I'm not going to get anywhere, But then one thing which I saw is that he's speaking to a lot of people around him, And then I was like, okay, let me just hear what he's saying. And I listened to what he's saying, and in those moments, I saw that there's certain things he didn't know. And I decided that I was going to, try and educate him. I'm going to put it that way. I tried to educate him, right? But then that never goes well. We started arguing back and forth. But then at the time, I didn't read, I didn't research anything. I was relying on what God had taught me throughout my whole life, what I had learned. And through that, in that people who he was talking with, they started to see that, no, man, what this guy is saying is right. They're like, okay, I'm actually going to hear the other guy out. So when my atheist friend left, they started to ask me questions. They're like, they decided to ask me questions where they're like, what happens with religion? How is God? Who is God? And through that interaction, the church actually has new members because of that whole situation. For example, Ezekiel, I don't know if you know, know that one there, yes? she she joined the church through that interaction. It was something which I didn't rely on myself in that moment, because I know that I'm still learning. The Bible is a lot, and through that I need to learn, but then I relied on what God had taught me, and through that it influenced her to do her own research. I didn't tell her to believe me. I told her to find God for herself, because when you find God for yourself, it becomes special to you. And when she did that, she joined the church. She's growing in the youth, and was seeing that through that reliance I had on God. So yeah, with that whole thing, right? I was looking into it, and I was seeing that your surroundings also matter. You know, at youth we were having a conversation last week where we were like, what did you ever pray for and God answered, and what happened? And Ati Sang was like, I pray for a lot of things, but then one thing I realized that God keeps on answering is when I pray for God to take away people which aren't meant for me. And with that, we're just like, yo, that's really deep, because God really takes away these people from our lives. But then in that moment, I reflected on myself, and I was like, you're relying on God to do something in your life. He wants you to be around the right people. When you find friends, we are relying on our own self, because you're like, I am here, I'm gonna go meet someone. You're using your own flesh, So sometimes you might attract the people who aren't for you, people who do the wrong things. But then once you rely on God and you actually pray about it, and you're like, God, I want you to keep the people in my life who are meant for me and who are of you, you're gonna see a change, because in that moment you're relying on God. Okay, so yeah, it was just something which was so nice to see that people actually pray about these things, because we see that they keep on relying on God. I just want to say thank you to the youth, because we're growing. It's a good surrounding for people my age. We're coming here, we're learning about God. And with us, the people who lead me, Godliness, Kelly, Kanye, we're a team, but then we don't rely on ourselves, because we know if we were to rely on ourselves, yeah, we would probably not have youth anymore. But then we relying on God to actually lead us into leading them. I think my mic is feeding, Uncle Nick. Okay, so with that, right, the youth also plays a role. Your surroundings play a role, because there's moments where you feel like, I can't do it. It's not your fault. You're going through stuff like depression, but then your surroundings influence you. When you see someone relying on God, when you hear testimonies about how God is changing people's lives, it also changes your life. It happens. It's something which God intends, and it's something which you're supposed to, be a part of. The church, the congregation, us together as one. I wanna speak about my story a bit. So for as long as I can remember, I remember being a kid who lived in Davidson, right? People don't believe me when I say this, but then, yes, there was a moment in my life where I stayed in Davidson, and in that moment, my mom and my dad weren't working, really stable jobs. So, yeah, we were just surviving at that point. One room, me and my sister, my mom, my dad, we were happy, right? But then we moved to Brakpan. We moved to Dalview, and in that moment, right, a lot of things started to change. My mom started getting a job. My dad started working, so we started becoming stable, slowly but surely. But God was, helping us become a stable family. But then, sadly, what happened was that I became sick, right? I became sick. I think I collapsed when I was in grade R, And then with that, my parents became stressed. Fine, it happens again, they become more stressed. Because at the time, they couldn't afford stuff like a hospital bill, guys. but luckily it was back then, so money used to be better. But then, yeah, it was a lot for my parents. But then, as a kid, I was really naughty. I used to do backflips, all these things a child does, right? But then I started complaining about how my knees are sore, my wrists are sore. And through that, my dad's like, no, man, you're not sick. It's because you play too much. You're always jumping off the couches. This is why your knees are sore. But then as time went on, it started to become worse. It became worse to a point where I couldn't walk, right? So with that, my mom is like, you know what? With the little money I have, I'm gonna hustle. I'm gonna go with my son to the hospital, and yeah, they told me that I had arthritis, right? I had juvenile arthritis, to be more specific, right? But then I don't wanna dig too deep into the story. Yeah, I had arthritis. It became really bad. Where I had to stay at the hospital. My mom couldn't really afford things. My dad was trying as well. And in this, right, weird enough, the church had a dry fast, right? It was the only time I think the church had a dry fast, if my mom told me correct. Yes. So with that, right, my mom used to, whenever she had an off day, she used to come to the hospital, and she used to sit with me, and she would pray with me. And you could see that she wasn't eating. At that moment, I think I was 5 or 6. I didn't understand why she's not eating, because I'm like, you brought me so much food, but then you're not eating. And you can see that she came from crying. She's emotional, she's sad, but then she kept on pushing. And with this, the church prayed for me. The church really did pray for me. They were, every Sunday they were just saying, oh, there's this kid, he's sick. They were praying for me and all that. And in that moment, I realized that I was young. I didn't understand God. I didn't know God for myself. But then in that moment, my mom was praying for me. And in that moment, she didn't have money to afford for a hospital bill. She didn't have money to actually push everything properly. But then my mom relied on God, my parents relied on God for me to get healed. And right now, I play rugby, a physical sport, which could probably hurt me. But then I am playing that sport, and it's through the church, and it's through the church, through God. So the church was praying for me. They were relying on God, because they can't really do anything. They can't rely on themselves to heal me. It's something internal. It's something inside me. It's my bones. They can't do anything about it besides pray. And in that moment, they were relying on God. So with that, right, I just want to give props to my mom. It's her birthday today, so today's pretty special. So, yeah. Everything I know about relying on God is through my mom. My mom is raising 5 kids right now. 2 who are out of school, me who's in high school, and 2 other small ones, I'm sure you've seen them, who are in primary school, and she's doing this off of 1 salary. That is someone who I've seen throughout my life rely on God. So, yeah, I just want to say, thank you to my mom for doing such. So, yeah, looking at Mark 2, verse 2 to 5. Yes. So, it says, they gathered in such large numbers that there was no room left, not even outside the door. And he preached the word to them. Some men came, bringing to him a paralyzed man, carried by 4 of them. Since they could not get him to Jesus because of the crowd, they made an opening in the roof above Jesus by digging through it, and they lowered the mat. The man was laying on. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralyzed man, "Son, your sins are forgiven." And it reminded me of my story, because I was like, he wasn't the reason why he got healed. It was the 4 other people who took him to Jesus. Through them relying on God, having faith, they were healed. And faith and reliance are the same because they both involve trust. You know, they involve trusting in God. And that's one thing which we're supposed to have as people, as the congregation. We're supposed to have faith and we're supposed to rely on God, you know. And there's multiple ways which God creates this room or this space where we can actually have that reliance on Him. Fellowship is very important. It's something which we practice every day at this church. I think we're a very intimate church because when we come here, we hug one another, you know, we give each other tight hugs, you know, we're always happy to see one another. And through that, we can talk, we can actually help one another. And sometimes, let's just say you're not given this environment, right? Praying, right? Praying and constantly reading the word is gonna give you that space, you know, it's gonna give you that opening where you can rely on God, you know. So just to close off, you know, I just want to say reliance in God is something so beautiful. And I just want to point out that right now as a church, sorry, right now as a church, we're actually practicing that with us wanting to move. We are relying on God to give us a new building, a building of our own, you know, and through praying, through reading the word, you know, through so many things, we can get this. So I just want to say thank you, guys. Thank you so much for giving me this platform. You know, it's very scary, but then I just want to remind you that God is always gonna be there, no matter what. You know, if you're struggling with a sin, if you're feeling like you're not worthy, God will always have His arms open. He's ready to welcome you. He's ready to take you in. He'll never abandon you. That's not who God is. He will always be there for you. He will always redirect us into the right path where we can fully rely on Him. So thank you, guys.